In the spring of 1881, on the big Nemaha bottoms in southeast Nebraska, a Bohemian named Vaclav Sedlak built a wall against a river that was not there. It was March, and the Nemaha lay low and brown, and half a mile from his door, an ordinary prairie creek a boy could wade. And Vaclav Sedlak spent his plowing days hauling earth in a stone boat and heaping it into a long, curved bank between his house and that harmless water. He could not tell his neighbors why, in any words they would sit still for. His English was a handful of broken stones. So they watched a foreigner wall out a creek that had never once climbed its banks in the 6 years white men had farmed that bottom. And they drew the only conclusion the sight allowed. The Bohemian was afraid of a creek. You have to understand what March was worth on the Nemaha bottoms. That black bottom soil was the richest dirt in the county, which is why men farmed a floodplain at all, and March was when it had to be worked. A day spent moving dirt that grew nothing was a day stolen from the dirt that grew everything. And here was Sedlak, who could barely make himself understood at the mill, spending his best spring days building a curved dike against a creek that sat there low and brown and laughed at him. By April, they had a name for his wall. By the last week of May, in the dark, at the height of water no man on that bottom had ever seen, his wall was the only reason some of them were alive to keep laughing. The talk started at Polly's mill, where the bottom farmers hauled their grain and their opinions. Vaclav Sedlak had come onto the Nemaha 2 years before with a wife, 2 small children, a wagon of plunder, and a way of farming that struck his neighbors as backward and turned out, every time, to be a year ahead of them. He plowed on a curve to the slope where they plowed straight and lost their topsoil to the first hard rain. He planted a garden a fool would drown, and it never drowned. He did not argue about any of it, because he could not, and so his neighbors decided that a man who could not defend his methods in English had no methods worth defending. Rausch, who farmed the next claim and had the loudest voice at the mill, said the Bohemian had built a fort to fight a Pavel, and asked whether he meant to charge the creek or just besiege it. The mill laughed. The name that stuck was Sedlak's Levee, said the way you would say a child's sandcastle. And by April, the whole bottom was using it, and grown men would drive past his curved bank and salute it. The church talk, in that county mostly German and grudging toward Bohemians to begin with, was no kinder for being quiet. A man who walls out a dry creek, they said, is a man who brought some old country fear across the water with him and could not leave it on the boat. They pitied his wife, Marie, who was well liked of the store for the eggs she brought and the little English she was brave enough to try. Pity for the wife is a common road into mockery of the man. Sedlak said almost nothing back all that spring because saying things was the one tool he did not have. He said one thing to Rausch at the mill when Rausch asked him to his face and loud for the crowd what he was so afraid of. Sedlak looked at the water and then at the flat black bottom all around them, and he said, in his slow and broken way, the words that the mill repeated for a week as proof he was simple. He said, "River remembers, water go where water go before." The mill thought it was foreign nonsense. It was the oldest law of moving water, spoken by a man who had grown up on the floodplain of a European river his grandfather had also tried to argue with. Water goes where water has gone before. He had read the whole bottom in one glance and told them its future in 5 words, and they laughed because the words came out broken. Still, the wall grew, curve by curve, and a few men on that bottom stopped laughing before the rest because a few of them had eyes. Old Dvorak, the only other Bohemian on the Nemaha, a man who had been there long enough to earn a little standing, walked Sedlak's dike one Sunday and came away sober. He told them at the mill that Sedlak had not built a fort. He had built the bank on a curve that hugged the old high-water scars in the cottonwoods, scars from before any of them came, and he had left a gap at the low end where a gate could go, and that no man cut a spillway into a wall he did not understand. Rausch said Dvorak was a Bohemian sticking up for a Bohemian. But it was noticed that Dvorak went home and looked a long while at the ground his own house stood on. To understand why a man walls out a dry creek, you would have to have stood on the Nemaha the year the water came before, and only the oldest settler had, and nobody had listened to him either. But you could learn most of it standing in Sedlak's yard, and I will tell you the one thing that stood in his window, and let it be. On the sill inside the house, where Marie kept it dusted, sat a smooth, brown river stone the size of a loaf, carried all the way from Bohemia in the bottom of a trunk, across an ocean and half a continent, and any fool could see it was worth nothing and weighed like sin to carry that far. And no one in that family ever explained why a poor man crossing the world would spend his one allowance of weight on a rock from a river he was never going to see again. Marie set fresh bread beside it to cool. She never said why the stone. A man and a woman carry their reasons, and some reasons are too heavy to put down and too dear to explain. The method itself Sedlak did not invent, and he never pretended to. He had grown up along a river in the old country that flooded on a schedule his people had been reading for 600 years, and the answer his village used was the answer villages on flooding rivers have always used. You do not stop the flood. Nobody stops a flood. You raise what you love above it, and you give the water somewhere else to go, and you make peace with losing the low ground, because the low ground is the floods, and always was. His curved dike did not wall the creek out. It could not, and he knew it, and that was the part no one at the mill could imagine, because they thought he was trying to win. He was not trying to win. He was choosing, ahead of time and in cold blood, which of his ground to give the river so that it would not take the rest. He said as much to Dvorak in their own tongue, and Dvorak carried the sense of it back and could not make the mill hear it. He does not fight the water, Dvorak said. He bargains with it. It sounded, translated and second-hand, like more Bohemian fog. It was a plan as old as farming. The dike ran in a long curve from the high ground above the house down to the high ground below it, bellied out toward the creek, so that rising water would meet it at a slant and be turned aside and led past the buildings rather than butting them head-on. At the low end he framed a gate, a heavy plank sluice he could open or shut, so he could let water out of the protected ground when he chose, on his terms, instead of having the dike burst and let it all in at once, on the river's terms. He set the house itself up onto low cribs of stacked cottonwood, a foot and a half off the black dirt. On his neighbor's theory, a foolish way to invite rot and mice. On his own theory, the difference between a wet floor and a drowned family. And out past the dike, between the wall and the creek, he deliberately left his lowest field open to the water, unplanted where it mattered, a sacrifice ground, the acres he had decided in March he could afford to lose in May. The first trial came in April, and it came for the gap in his plan, and it taught him something for the price of a scare. A quick, hard rain, nothing like a flood, just a spring downpour, and the runoff came off the higher ground behind his place, from the land side, and pooled against the inside of his own dike, because a wall that keeps water out also keeps water in. For an afternoon, Sedlak had a pond in his own yard that his own wall would not let drain, and Rausch, who happened by, had a story that fed the mill for a week. The Bohemian built a wall to keep the creek out, Rausch said, and drowned himself with his own rain. It was true, and it was funny, and it was nowhere near the whole of it. Sedlak did not argue. He took his spade to the low end of the dike and cut a second gate, a small one, on the land side, screened with a hurdle of woven willow so it would pass water but not soil. And he hung both his gates so that one let the river's water out and the other let the sky's water out, each in its own direction. The rain pond drained by evening. The failure cost him 2 days and the last of the mill's patience. It also closed the one hole the water had found, which was the whole use of a failure, if a man is the kind who reads them. By the last week of April, the wall was done, and I will tell you honestly what it looked like from the mill road, because every farmer on the bottom drove past it and formed his opinion. It looked like a long, low, grassy welt across good bottom ground, curved for no reason a straight-thinking man could see, walling a wide green nothing between itself and a creek you could spit across. His house sat up on its silly stilts behind it like a hen roosting. His best low field lay open and unplanted beyond the wall, the richest acres on the place given over to weeds, which to a bottom farmer was very nearly a sin. Set against the clean, straight-plowed claims up and down the Nemaha, it was the work of a man who did not understand the country, and the country told him so all spring. In English, he was spared the sharpest edges of, only because he could not follow it fast. The river was 4 weeks from teaching the whole bottom to read. May came in wet, not dangerous at first, only wet. A rain every few days that kept the ground soft and the creek full, and the corn late going in. Then it settled into something the old settler said he had seen only once, a gray, wet lid clamped down over the whole watershed. Rain up on the high prairie to the west, where the Nemaha was born. Rain on the bottoms where it ran. Rain for 11 days with hardly a dry hour. And the creek came up out of its low brown bed a little more each morning, quiet and steady and wrong. The bottom farmers watched it climb toward the top of its banks and told each other it would crest any day, the way it always had. Dvorak did not say that. Dvorak moved his hogs to high ground and his good furniture to the loft, and told the mill they were fools, and the mill told Dvorak he had caught the Bohemian's fever. Something was coming down the Nemaha that no one living on it had ever measured. There was one thing more Sedlak did in that last wet week, and no one understood it, and it was the thing that saved the most. When the creek was near the top of its banks, but had not yet touched his dike, when there was still time and the wall still stood dry, he opened his river gate. On purpose. He let the rising water walk quietly through his own gate and out across his sacrifice field, the low acres he had left open in March, and he let it stand there and spread and slow, ankle-deep, then knee-deep, over ground he had already written off. Rausch saw it from the road and could not believe his eyes, and told it at the mill as the final proof the man was mad. The Bohemian spent all spring building a wall to keep the river out, Rausch said, and now that the river's come, he's opened the door and invited it in. And every man at the mill laughed, because it did look exactly, precisely like that. Sedlak, who could not have explained it to them in an hour of his broken English, said the only thing he had time to say, to Dvorak, who understood. He said, "Give the river a room, or it takes the house." The flood came in the dark, on the 24th of May, 1881, and by the time it came, the laughing was done, because a thing had happened up the watershed that turned a wet spring into a wall of water. Away to the west, where nobody on the bottom could see it, the rain had filled every draw and feeder creek at once, and they all emptied into the Nemaha in the same few hours. And somewhere upstream, a jam of drift and brush that had dammed the swollen creek let go all at once in the night. What came down onto the bottom was not a rising creek anymore. It was a crest, a moving shoulder of black water higher than any bank, carrying whole trees and fence lines and the front wall of somebody's barn. And it came in the dark, when men were asleep, which is the flood's oldest and cruelest habit. The water did not care whose claim it crossed, or which of them had laughed at the wall. Now I will tell you about that night in 3 places along the Nemaha, because the river graded every man's spring work in the same few hours, and it did not grade on a curve. Rausch, who had the loudest voice at the mill and the straightest plow on the bottom, woke to water already in his house, He had built well and square and low, tight to the good black dirt, the way a proud farmer does, and the flood came up through his floor in the dark before he ever heard it coming. He got his wife and his 3 children onto the roof of his own house in their nightclothes, in the cold and the rain and the roar. And there they clung, in the pitch black, while the water pulled his barn apart under them, and carried off his stock and his seed and his wagon and the fences he had left behind. And Rausch shouted into the dark for help that could not come, because every other man on that bottom was fighting for his own roof. They lived. They lived because the house held, and the crest did not quite reach the ridgepole. And that was luck, not work. And Rausch knew the difference by morning. Down the bottom, old Dvorak, who had listened, had his family and his hogs and his good furniture up on the high ground behind his claim. And he lost his crop and his low barn, and rode out the night wet and ruined but whole, on ground he had chosen in daylight, and he counted himself among the fortunate, and he was right to. But it is the third place I have brought you here to see. Behind the curved wall that the whole bottom had laughed at, on his cottonwood stilts, Vaclav Sedlak fought the river all night the way he had planned to fight it in March, and he did not fight it by trying to stop it. When the crest came down and slammed against the belly of his dike, the curve did what he had shaped it to do. It took the blow at a slant and turned the main push of the water aside and let it roaring around the house and past it, down toward the low end, exactly as the old high-water scars in the cottonwoods had told him the water wanted to go. The water he had already let into his sacrifice field stood there to meet the crest and take the speed out of it, so that the flood arrived at his wall not as a battering ram, but as a rising weight, and a rising weight a good dike can hold when a battering ram would have burst it. All night Sedlak and Marie worked their 2 gates by lantern light, opening the river gate wider as the water rose to bleed the pressure off into the sacrifice ground, shutting it as the crest passed, reading the black water by the lantern and the sound of it, and giving it room, always giving it somewhere to go that was not their house. And the plan held, all night, on the west and the north and against the main crest, exactly as he had built it to hold. And near dawn, at the low end, it began to fail. I promised you I would tell this true, and the truth is that Vaclav Sedlak's wall did not save everything, and that the last hour of that night was the hour that showed what the man was really made of, which was not a perfect plan, but a clear head over a breaking one. Toward morning, with the crest sitting on his dike hour after hour, the water found the landside gate, the small one he had cut in April to drain his rain pond, and it began to work at the willow hurdle and the earth around it, and Sedlak, wading chest-deep in his own yard with the lantern held high, saw the thing every dike builder dreads, the first dark thread of water piping through the base of his own wall from the low end, the sign that the wall was beginning to come apart from the inside, where he could not stop it with his hands. He had a choice then, in the dark, in the water, with his family up on the stilted house behind him, and no time to think it twice. He could try to save the whole wall, and if the wall let go all at once, the crest would come through the breach in a rush, and the house on its stilts might stand, or might not. Or he could give the river more than he had already given it, open both gates wide, and cut the dike himself at the low end, on his own terms, and let the flood pour through into the whole of his bottom ground, all of it now, the sacrifice field and the good field alike, drowning his entire crop and his spring's plowing and the richest dirt in the county, in order to take the killing pressure off the wall that stood between the water and his children. He cut his own wall. He waded down to the low end in the dark with a spade, and he opened his own dike and let the river have his whole farm, every acre of bottom he owned, rather than gamble his family on the wall holding one more hour. The flood came through the cut he made and spread out flat and slow across all his ground, and lost its rage in the spreading, and the house stood on its stilts above a brown lake that had been, the day before, the best cropland on the Nemaha. He drowned his own year with his own hands to keep the water from having to be stopped at all. By the gray light of morning, Marie and the 2 children were dry on the floor of a house standing in the middle of a flood, and every seed Vaclav Sedlak had put in the ground that spring was gone. I promised the plan would crack, and it cracked, and here is the plain sense of why it worked anyway. A flood is only water with somewhere it wants to go, and too much of it. You cannot stop that. Every man on the bottom who tried to stop it by building low and tight and standing in its way got knocked down, because standing in front of a flood is standing in front of the whole weight of a rained-on country. What Sedlak understood, from a river 600 years older than the Nemaha in its habits, was that the water cannot be stopped and does not have to be. It has to be steered and slowed, and above all, it has to be given room, a low place you have chosen to lose, so that it does not take the high place you cannot afford to lose. His curve steered it. His sacrifice field slowed it. His stilts lifted his family above it. And when even that was not enough, his willingness to open his own wall and drown his own crop was the last room he had to give, and he gave it, and the river took the room instead of the house. It was not that his wall was stronger than the flood. Nothing is stronger than the flood. It was that he had decided in March, in cold blood, what he would give the river when it came, and so, when it came in the dark, he was not bargaining in a panic, like Rausch on his roof. He was paying a bill he had figured months before. Mind, it cost him everything a year can cost. Dvorak, who only moved to high ground, saved as much as Sedlak did, and lost less doing it, and an honest telling has to say so. Sedlak lost his entire crop, his plowing, his seed, and a summer of hunger followed for that family that the high ground farmers did not share. The stilts saved the house, but the black water stood in his bottom for a week and left it a foot deep in muck that had to be dug out by hand. It was not a triumph. It was a man paying the least ruinous of several ruins, on purpose, with his eyes open, and knowing the whole time that a luckier man on higher ground would pay less. He never claimed he had beaten the river. He had only refused to let it choose for him. The water went down over the following week, sullen and slow, and the bottom counted its dead and its ruin. 2 children from a family at the far end of the Nemaha were lost that night, and no wall of anyone's would have saved them, and I will not pretend this is a story with no graves in it. Barns were gone up and down the creek, and stock past counting, and Rausch stood in the wreck of the best straight-plowed claim on the bottom, with nothing left but the house he and his family had clung to. And in the middle of it, absurd and dripping, and standing in a drained brown lake, Vaclav Sedlak's house sat whole and dry on its cottonwood stilts, and his family walked out of it alive, and the whole bottom, coming past on the mill road as the water fell, looked at that house, standing where a house had no business surviving, and did not say one word. The house on the stilts, alive in the middle of the flood, was an argument that needed no English. Here is the part the bottom had to swallow, and it swallowed it slowly, being a proud and German and Bohemian doubting stretch of country. No one came and apologized to Vaclav Sedlak, because he could not have followed the speech, and because the men who owed him one were not the apologizing kind. What happened instead was quieter, and it took years. That fall, when Sedlak began to rebuild his dike, higher this time and longer, 3 neighbors came without being asked, and worked beside him with their own teams and their own stone boats, and among them was Rausch, who had lost the most and learned the most. And Rausch could not say in Bohemian what he had come to say, and Sedlak could not have taken it easily in English. So the 2 of them said nothing at all, and moved dirt together for a week, and that was the apology, made of earth, in a language both men could read. When the wall was done, Rausch went home and began to raise his own house up onto cribs, and to plow a curve above his own low ground, and he never called it Sedlak's levee again. He called it the Wall and taught his sons to build one. Dvorak, who had been right early and quietly, said the truest thing anyone said about it, and he said it in English so the bottom would keep it. He does not fight the river, Dvorak said. He pays it.
And that is why he still has a house. The name wore off the way names do. Within a few years, half the bottom farmed the way the Bohemian did, on stilts and curves, and with a low field left open for the water. And the young men doing it had no idea they were copying a foreigner their fathers had mocked, and thought it was simply how you farmed a bottom, which, by then, it was. When the county, a generation on, built its first real levees along the Nemaha with public money and an engineer from the east, the engineer laid them on curves and left overflow ground for the high water, and called it the newest science, and never knew that a Bohemian who could not speak English had built the same idea by hand out of a river stone's worth of old country memory 30 years before, and been laughed at for it up and down the bottom. I have stood on that ground as an old man, and the county levee runs where Sedlak's wall ran, on the same curve, because the river has not changed its mind about where it wants to go, and never will. Vaclav Sedlak lies in the high-ground cemetery above the bottom, on the ground that does not flood, and his stone is an ordinary gray one, but his family sat beside it, half buried in the grass, a smooth brown river rock the size of a loaf, carried once across an ocean, and no words on it, because the man it marks never had the English to waste, and never needed it. People ask what the flood year taught the Nemaha. They want something about courage, and there was courage on Rausch's roof that night, holding his children above the black water. But courage on the roof is what the river charges a man who did not prepare. What Sedlak had was not courage, it was humility. The particular humility of a man who had decided, long before the water came, that he could not beat the river and would not try, and would instead find out exactly what it wanted and give it that much and not 1 inch more. He is the only man I ever knew who won against a flood, and he won by surrendering, on purpose, in March, the ground the river was always going to take. Fight the water, and it kills you. Give it a room, and it will take the room, and leave you the house. That was the whole of his wisdom, and he carried it across the world in the shape of a stone, and we called him Afraid of a Creek. Now the people in this story are ours, but here is what is true. The rivers of the eastern plains flooded hard and often in the settlement years, and families who built low and tight on the rich bottom soil were drowned out again and again through the 1880s and after. You cannot stop a flood, and the oldest and best answer to one is not a wall that fights the water, but a system that steers and slows it and gives it somewhere to go. Curved levees set back from the channel, gates and spillways to relieve the pressure, houses raised on piers above the flood line, and low ground deliberately left as overflow to be sacrificed. Engineers call it floodplain management now, and it is exactly what riverside villages in Europe and elsewhere had practiced by hand for centuries. A levee that gives the river room outlasts a wall that only defies it, and modern flood engineering has come all the way back around to designed overflow ground, after a century of learning that walls alone fail. The family, the bottom, and the town are imagined. The river and the old, hard wisdom of yielding to it are exactly as they were.